Okay, this this video is going to be um, about sorry about exterior styles of a house and as to how they history and geography affects the design, affected the design of buildings and houses over the years. And so what we're going to look at is some of the traditional type um, housing styles. These were in commercial buildings also, but the main focus of this course is going to be on residential, on housing. And so the exterior styles were influenced by designers and by builders based on what was popular at the time, what they envisioned, what the geography needed as far as the weather uh, and the effects of that on a house. And so a lot of the things were rather regional based on the needs of the people that live there, because what works well in, let's say, the northeastern United States generally doesn't work well in Arizona, and what works well in Arizona generally doesn't work well in the low country like Louisiana and coastal South Carolina. So buildings were designed, with the geography, the area and the weather had an influence, and then the style. A lot of it came from ancient Rome or from Greek, and then from Britain or European countries. So we're going to go through some of these things here and see how these historical influences shape home designs. Okay, so this building here, you've probably seen photos of it. Um, it's called Falling Water. It was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. And the interesting thing about this one and this kind of movement that he was involved with during his career, uh, they felt like buildings should fit into the landscape around where where the building is, where you're going to build it. And so this one was designed. It fits right in place here with the stream and the waterfall running under it. He used a lot of locally sourced materials. A lot of the stone came from nearby, and he used cast in place concrete in a lot of the construction, and which was relatively new at the time to use cast in place concrete as a finished material so that you would actually see it on the outside. And it was totally new to use cantilevered cast in place concrete, which these balconies and these floors that kind of stick out. Now, they had done that with wood in the past, but not quite that far or large. But he was doing it with concrete, which was totally new. So this is a very interesting house. You can look it up on the internet or on uh, um, Wikipedia to kind of get an idea of some more information about it. Okay, so our early traditional home styles. This first one here is called a salt box, and it was predominant in the northeastern United States. Uh, it could be a one story. Typically, it was a two-story or two and a half story, and then the roof on the rear of the building would slope down to a single story building, or even lower than a single story, to provide storage in the back here. Might have even kept animals in there. That's potential. Could have been the kitchen area, whatever. Uh, and here's a an actual historical salt box house, so you can kind of see what they look like. And interesting thing about these is that the sloping roof side was typically oriented toward the prevailing winds, where the majority of the storms would come from, and that protected the front of the house, uh, from those rain and hail and snow and things like that. Notice there's very little overhang on the roof. A lot of these northeastern houses had very little overhang on the ends, on the gable ends, and even the eaves. So there's very little overhang on those. Okay, this one is what we would call a southern colonial. or a plantation style home. Um, these were uh, almost always a two-story house. They were longer than they were deep. Okay, often they might be one room deep, at the most two rooms deep, but they would be 2 to 3 rooms long, or even longer. And there was a central entry. Uh, there might be a roof over that, making a porch or a portico to shade that, but it was symmetrical left and right if there were fireplaces there on either end of the house. And these houses typically had taller than normal ceiling heights. So the ceilings might be 10 feet or even 12 feet tall. And that provided kind of a natural cooling in that the hot air gathers near the ceiling. Okay, and if you raise the ceiling, then you raise that level of hot air out of the living space. And of course, there would be large windows on the front and on the rear that could be opened, and it would create a breeze going through there, help move the warm air out and cooling the house. Here we have what we would call a Dutch colonial, and the Dutch style of housing often may be called a barn style, uh, but it has a what we call a gambrel roof, in that the roof has two planes on each side, and the roof is actually the exterior wall of the house. Here's an example. It's a little easier to see, but it being a colonial style, meaning it's a central entryway and symmetrical left to right, but it has this gambrel style roof. And so the roof itself becomes the exterior wall of the second floor. And often there'll be dormers. It could be a shed dormer like this one that encompassed possibly 2 rooms, or it could be individual, what we would call a doghouse dormer, which looks like a little doghouse that would be stuck on there. Or there may not be a dormer at all. Okay, it just each one was a little bit different. Okay, here we have what's called a Cape Cod, and these were typically a 1 story, maybe a 1.5 story, uh, symmetrical central entryway, symmetrical left to right, but the fireplace was in the center of the house, and this way the heat generated from that fireplace would radiate throughout the entire house, as opposed to the styles where the fireplace is on the end, where it only heated that one end of the house. And here's an example of a historical Cape Cod that's in desperate need of repair. And here we have an example of what's called a Cape Ann, which is similar to the Cape Cod, except for it had a gambrel roof. And it is not, typically these were not symmetrical across the front, but the doorway, the entryway was at one end of the house. Okay, but it did have a gambrel roof. Okay, here we have what's called a Garrison style home. And the Garrisons, the second floor would cantilever out over the first floor. Up in the 1700s and early 1800s, most houses were built with what we would call balloon framing, if we gave it that name, but they were mostly timbers as opposed to individual studs like we use in houses now. And the timbers or the studs would go from the foundation all the way to the roof line, which made for some very long pieces of lumber that would be 20 to 25 feet tall. The Garrison style kind of changed that, in that now the timbers only had to go for the height of that floor. So they would build the wall for the first floor and then build the floor for the second floor on top of it, and then build the walls for the second floor, much like we do today in what's called platform framing. And we're going to get more into framing types later in the semester. But it made a kind of a change in the way buildings were made, because now you didn't have to have 25 feet lumber. You only had to have 8 to 10 foot long pieces of lumber. So it made better utilization of the materials. And they cantilevered out, a foot to 2 feet. A lot of speculation as to why. It could have been for protection, during a battle of some kind. So, you know, anybody sneaking up to the house, you could, look down from the second floor, you could see them down there. Um, One story that I read was that a town taxed their houses based on the square footage of the foundation. And so by increasing the size of the second floor, you could get more house and less tax. Okay, so there's a number of different stories as to why that. But you'll still see this in some housing styles in which part of the second floor will cantilever out over the first floor. Okay, what we call a colonial style basically means that it's typically two-story, central entryway, often no porch over the entryway, but it's symmetrical left to right. There'll be two sets of windows on either side of the entryway, and often the entryway will have this ornate, pediment and frieze and styling and stuff around the doorway. But there were colonial it transcends lots of different types, like your Southern colonial and French colonial and Dutch colonial, such as that. So there's a lot of different types. Colonial meaning centralized entry, symmetrical left to right, basically. And here's one that had French influence. Now these had covered porches on the front and often on the back also, but you still got the central entry and symmetrical left to right. These were popular in the French settled areas of the country, particularly Louisiana and southern Mississippi. In those areas were very warm weather, so the porches provided shade over the house to help cool the house, the living area. You could open the windows up on the front and the back and get a breeze blowing through the house to help cool it. And often, uh, in the warmer months, they would move their beds out onto the porch and drape, mosquito netting over them and sleep on the porch as opposed to sleeping inside the hot house. Here's a list of some of the other types um, that the textbook may mention, may not. The Federal and Greek Revival, they were. You'll see that more so in federal type buildings, okay, government type buildings or banks, post offices, things like that. Um, Not so much houses, but there are some houses that have that styling. Um, let's see, Spanish styles would be adobe type houses, popular in Florida and California. The ranch style was popular in the western states originally because it was typically a one-story house, kind of low and long with a large overhang to provide shade against the house. Victorians are very ornate and often eclectic in appearance. Um, and there's several different styles of Victorian, but they're pretty interesting. Okay, so what you're going to do is you're going to pick a style of house, uh, either from the video here or from the textbook or from the resources on Wikipedia, and prepare a 1 to 2 page document, Word document, that has a description of the house, and it's going to list out, how do you identify this house? What's its features that make it a Victorian house per se, and provide a couple of photos, one of an original historical style of that building, and then a modern day version of that building. And then please include where you got those pictures from. If you get it from a website, cite the website that it came from, uh, not just Google pictures, okay? But who actually took the photo. And put all that together following the instructions in Blackboard and submit that in the Dropbox.